The Sheathipede-class shuttle is one of the most underrated ships of the prequel trilogy, with nearly 10 distinct variants and spin-offs, yet relatively little screen time. I covered these once in the past, but it's time to take a much closer look at each of them. Perhaps even the closest look possible. I'm Joey from Radio Free Coruscant, and this is the definitive guide to the Sheathipede. Overview. In general, the Heor-Chal Engineering Corporation Sheathipede-class transport shuttle was a small, luxurious, unarmed shuttlecraft used by the Trade Federation, Confederacy of Independent Systems, and various private citizens. It was designed to resemble a Neimoidian soldier Beetle, with its hull divided into 3 distinct segments. The front section held the ship's narrow cockpit, an antenna cluster at the top in most cases, and a grille at the front with 1 to 3 headlights, and likely some sensors as well. Oddly, on the first 2 models of Sheathipede, the outboard headlights were blue, while the larger center headlight was yellow, but on the Clone Wars models, the colors were reversed, and all 3 were the same size. The middle section typically had no identifiable or interesting external features, but held the ship's tiny passenger cabin inside. We unfortunately don't know what this looked like for the original Sheathipede, only the later models of the ship. The original Sheathipede was described as having a very comfortable and luxurious interior for its wealthy passengers, but Sheathipedes produced after the start of the Clone Wars were manufactured with a more bare-bones, utilitarian interior to cut costs and make it more suitable for the battle droids and cargo the shuttles tended to carry at that time. The rear segment of the Sheathipede was by far its most distinctive, with the ship's gigantic vertical fin sprouting from here. The purpose of this fin isn't officially stated, but it seemed to contain some exposed equipment on certain models of the Sheathipede, and was probably used to radiate heat from the ship's nearby engines and reactor. I expect the reactor and hyperdrive were probably located in the base of the fin. Fuel may have been stored there too, but I feel like that would be more likely located in the flared sides of the shuttle. Beneath the fin was the ship's rear-facing boarding ramp, and what seems to be a small boarding vestibule. The shuttle had 2 rear doors that opened to the side, and the boarding ramp automatically extended out from below them when they were opened. A set of 4 lights above the doors could illuminate the ramp when boarding or disembarking at night. We never get to see more than a foot or 2 inside the original model of Sheathipede, but in many cases on the later models there appears to be a closed door roughly in line with the boundary between the rear and middle segments. This rear space could potentially be used for a cargo bay or possibly an airlock, though the latter would be a little bit difficult due to the long overhanging stern of the ship. I like to think that it overhangs so far to give the ship's passengers a bit of shade or protection from the rain when loading or unloading, but that's probably just a coincidental perk of its design. This final part of the ship housed its 2 yellow engines, and its rear landing gear on most variants of the shuttle, which folded up above the doors in flight. The forward landing gear were located below the cockpit. The Sheathipede's landing gear were somewhat unusual in a couple different ways. For starters, this ship is one of the very few in the galaxy whose landing gear do not fully retract. This was changed on the final 2 versions of the ship, and its spin-offs the Maxilipede and Utilipede, but on the majority of Sheathipedes, the landing gear simply hugged the outer hull in flight. I assume this was done to either save space within the hull or save money on the design, but it seems like it would result in unnecessary wear and tear on the landing gear. Presumably, this is why it was eventually changed. The other oddity of the Sheathipede's landing gear is that its tiny bug-like footprint was only capable of landing on hard, well-constructed landing pads. The ship was built this way due to Neimoidian classism and their distaste for dealing with the farmers, miners, and other working-class tradesmen employed by the Trade Federation. Though I suspect this served as more of an excuse not to land at a farm or mine than an actual hard technical limitation. It's not like the shuttle could have weighed all that much at its tiny size, and it surely wouldn't have sunk very far into anything other than loose sand or mud. Stone or even hard-packed dirt should work just fine, and it's not like it would be difficult to pour some concrete if necessary. Earth airports typically require their pavement to be 6 to 18 inches thick, depending on the type of aircraft serviced and their frequency of use, so I would think a 20 by 20 meter concrete pad a foot thick should be a simple and affordable solution to any Trade Federation contractor whose Neimoidian employers are pretending not to be able to come and visit them. Such a pad wouldn't even cost that much in the grand scheme of things, around $26,000 for concrete or $18,000 for asphalt in real life if the numbers I found online were accurate, plus a bit more for labor. Probably less in Star Wars due to the weird scaling of their money after you exceed a few thousand credits. Not that it matters. I'm fairly certain we see Sheathipedes land on bare dirt several times throughout the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, so clearly the Neimoidians were just lying through their teeth about this particular limitation, and would undoubtedly come up with some other excuse not to visit. In-universe, the designers of the Sheathipede are unknown, but they were likely either a Neimoidian or a Zycharian working for Heor-Chal Engineering. In real life, the ship was designed by concept artist Doug Chiang and constructed by ILM model maker Larry Tan and future Mythbuster Adam Savage. General specifications. The Sheathipede came in at least 5 distinct iterations, but for some reason there is no official distinction between any of them other than one additional extended variant. In this way, the Sheathipede is a bit like most Earth vehicles, where there are many generations of any given car over the decades of its production, and the car's appearance, capabilities, and even size tend to change significantly between each generation. Most of the stats of each model of Sheathipede are shared between them, and when a model deviates from those, I will cover it in that model's section of the video. The average Sheathipede measured 14.4 meters long by about 7 meters wide and 11 meters tall. It had a Class 1 hyperdrive and a top atmospheric speed of 880 kilometers per hour. The ship required 1 to 4 crew and could carry 8 to 10 passengers. In canon, it was listed as having a cargo capacity of 150 tons with no passengers aboard, though that would be 50% more than even the YT-1300 light freighter could carry, at only a fraction of that ship's size, so I think the Legends figure of just 1 ton makes more sense. The 150-ton figure comes from an RPG sourcebook, so this number may have been fudged a bit to meet some gameplay requirement. It could also have just been a typo, and it was meant to carry 15 tons, though that still seems like a lot. The ship could also have 1 week to 2 months of consumables, and came in at a cost of 120,000 credits new, or probably around 65,000 used. Sheathipede 1. Most of what I have described about the Sheathipede so far comes from the original version of the ship, so for the sake of brevity I will not be repeating it. The most unique design element of the Sheathipede Mark I was its cockpit. This older model was the most crew-intensive version of the ship, requiring a pilot, co-pilot, comms operator, and an engineer. Its distinctive bulbous cockpit reflects this, with seating, displays, and controls for all 4 under an impressively gigantic canopy. In fact, this canopy shows us that, despite its relatively small absolute dimensions, the Sheathipede is actually a far larger ship than it appears at a glance. Most Star Wars ships are, but it is a lot more severe on the Sheathipede due to its proportionally oversized canopy. It looks like it should be the size of a starfighter, but it's actually about 1 person longer than an ordinary American school bus in real life, 3 school buses wide, and a little taller than a 3-story building. The cockpit canopy is actually large enough to fit an entire Volkswagen Beetle inside it with headroom to spare, though you'd probably have a very hard time getting it in there. Anyway, we actually barely get a glimpse of the cockpit of the Sheathipede 1 in Revenge of the Sith as General Grievous's shuttle lands on Utapau, and we see that the 4 pilot battle droids operating it barely take up any room inside, with like 3 feet of headroom above them. While I doubt there was ever a point where Neimoidian businessmen and politicians were intended to fly it themselves, it seems to me that the cockpit was built this way to at least allow them to come up front and do some sightseeing. That may be what the very large display screen at the top of the cockpit is for as well. Each of its crew members had their own screens, and this larger screen would only be visible to 2 of them, so I like to think that this screen is for the passengers to be able to track their flight progress, view intership communications, or see miscellaneous other useful information. Finally, towards the rear of the cockpit, we see 3 tiny fins on the top of the canopy. The exact purpose of these is unknown, but they must not have been too important, because the Mark I was the only Sheathipede variant that included them, as far as I can tell. This version of the Sheathipede was in service at least as early as 32 BBY, when one was used by Viceroy Newt Gunray to travel to Naboo. It was likely around for at least a few years, if not a decade or more before that, and it was in use at least through to the end of the Clone Wars in 19 BBY. Automated Sheathipede. A direct spin-off of the Sheathipede Mark I is the Automated Sheathipede, or Sheathipede 1.5, I suppose. Its hull was almost identical to that of the Mark I, but its cockpit canopy was removed and replaced with blank armor plating, as its crew were replaced by an onboard droid brain. I'm not sure why they couldn't have left the huge windows in place and given the ship's passengers an unparalleled panoramic view of the outside, but maybe Neimoidians get space sick and don't want to be able to see out or something. Who knows? The passenger cabin was extended forward into the space where the cockpit had been, giving the ship room for at least 2 to 4 extra passengers, or maybe just some extra legroom for the existing 6 to 10. The tiny fins ahead of the communication masts were also lost, but other than that, the rest of the automated variant was essentially the same as the original. Funnily enough, this even included the headlights, which you wouldn't think would be necessary for an automated ship. Perhaps they were more running lights for the people around it when it took off or landed, though. This version of the shuttle went on to be used fairly commonly by the Separatists in the Clone Wars, and Trade Federation Viceroy Newt Gunray's personal shuttle, the Lapis Cutter, was one of these as well. The automated Sheathipede saw use at least as early as the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, and like the Sheathipede, it remained in service throughout the Clone Wars and likely beyond. Sheathipede 2. Around the start of the Clone Wars, the Separatists decided that they required an updated version of the Sheathipede to suit their light transportation needs. It was to be crewed by only 2, a pilot and a gunner, and its interior would not need the fine furnishings of the original model, as it was going to primarily be used by droids. This design brief resulted in what we are going to call the Sheathipede 2, though again I must reiterate that there is no official in-universe distinction between any of them, except for the extended Type B that we will look at next. The Sheathipede 2 was a much bigger departure from the shape and look of the original than the automated model had been. Its tail fin was shortened by about 1 meter to more easily fit in a wider variety of hangars. The aft third of the ship was also widened by about 1.5 meters on each side to accommodate a pair of laser cannons, giving it the look of having 2 very stubby wings. A third laser cannon was also added to the top of the vertical fin. The ship's antennae were then shortened to clear the cannon barrel. In fact, the whole communications mast assembly was redesigned. Where it once had 1 tall and 2 medium antennae, now it only had 2 short ones. Overall, the ship now had a size of 14.4 meters long by about 10 meters wide and 9.5 meters tall. The cockpit was widened and rounded out to take up the entire width of the forward segment of the ship, the general geometry of which was also slightly reworked. I'm not really sure why this was necessary. Originally, I thought it was to allow the pilot and gunner to sit side by side, but upon closer inspection of the Sheathipede 1 seen in Revenge of the Sith, it seems the pilot and co-pilot seat were already next to one another, as that cockpit is far more spacious than it looks from the outside, like we discussed. It would also give the gunner a much better view than the new Sheathipede did, not that this one was exactly lacking in window real estate either. The only thing I can think of to explain this redesign is to give the cockpit better armor. This idea is also supported by other areas on the ship, like its midsection and tail fin, where formerly exposed components seem to have been covered up. The real explanation for those changes can just be chalked up to the overly simplified art style of the early seasons of the Clone Wars cartoon, but it would make sense for a more militarized version of the shuttle to have these changes made to it in-universe too, especially in conjunction with the better armored cockpit. This version of the ship saw use throughout the Clone Wars, and many fell into private use after the defeat of the Separatists. It served alongside the automated Sheathipede, and was typically used to carry separatist VIPs or valuable cargo on longer flights where a Vulture droid escort wouldn't be possible, or just carried aboard ships that were more likely to see combat. Sheathipede Type B. The only variant of the Sheathipede with an official in-universe designation, the Class Type B was also the biggest departure from the original format of the ship so far. This was an extended version of the Sheathipede 2, used primarily for cargo hauling. Its middle segment was tripled in length, giving it a total size of around 22 meters long by 10 wide and 9.5 tall. We don't know what its new carrying capacity was for sure, but I would guess a total of 30 passengers or more to be reasonable, and the seemingly erroneous cannon cargo capacity of 150 tons for the Sheathipede might be possible for the Type B, since almost its entire internal volume is taken up by its cargo hold. I would still probably guess only 30 to 50 tons, though. Despite the use of the Sheathipede 2 hull as its base, the Type B lacked the side cannons of that version of the ship, though it still retained the dorsal cannon. Its pair of antennae were also removed. This version of the Sheathipede was fairly rare, though it still made a sizable impact on galactic history, with one being used by a crew of bounty hunters in a mission to kidnap Chancellor Palpatine on Naboo, and another being captured by the Republic and used to infiltrate the Separatist Citadel prison on Lola Sayu to rescue a captured Jedi Master. I expect the Type B Sheathipede probably became quite popular with transit lines and cargo companies on former Separatist worlds after the Clone Wars as well. Sheathipede 3. Almost nothing is known of this next version of the Sheathipede, which is a shame because it is one of the most beautiful iterations of the ship. In fact, its original unmodified form has only appeared once, in 3 short scenes of an episode of Star Wars Rebels. Though to make up for this, a modified Sheathipede 3 is undoubtedly the most famous example of the Sheathipede in-universe or out, specifically the Phantom II used by the crew of the Ghost in Star Wars Rebels and Ahsoka. The Sheathipede 3 appears to me to be a modernized and refreshed version of the original Sheathipede. Like the original, it was sleek, stylish, and unarmed. It seemed to be better armored though, with a much thicker and more boat-shaped lower hull and a much smaller cockpit window. Because of the thicker lower hull, there was enough space for the landing gear to be fully retracted inside the ship for protection in flight, though there was still no external cover over them. The landing gear were also much smaller than those of the original, aiding in their retractability. The ship's vertical fin was quite a lot taller and longer than that of the original, and blended with the rear hull even more organically. However, its hull was a bit shorter in height, so the ship overall was actually about the same size as the original as best as I can tell, 14.4 by 7 by 10 meters. Its middle segment was also quite a bit shorter in length than on previous models, but the rear segment was made longer to compensate, so again, still the same size. One source gives this variant a length of 10.5 meters instead, but we can plainly see on several occasions, including its very first episode, that it is still essentially the same size, 14.4 meters. At a 10.5 meter size, nearly anyone boarding the ship would almost be hitting their head on the top of its doorframe at the rear. The shuttle's size may have been fudged to 10.5 meters for scenes where the Phantom was docked to the Ghost, but upon close inspection of many of them, I'm still pretty sure it's the same size there, too. This figure comes from an information packet included with a die-cast model of the Phantom II as depicted in the Ahsoka series, but even there it still appears to be the normal larger size. Anyway, in keeping with the streamlining of the Sheathipede 1 design, it also had only one communications antenna, and a much smaller one at that. This version of the ship was also logistically streamlined as well, requiring only one pilot, though all of them could be flown by just one if necessary anyway. The original's 3 large headlights were pared back to just one small one as well, and a small airlock hatch was built into the underside of the shuttle for docking to other small craft, but that was about it as far as design changes go. Like I said, it basically appeared to just be a modernized and improved version of the original. The Sheathipede 3 was introduced sometime around the end of the Clone Wars, and unfortunately we have no idea how common they were. Only 3 have ever been seen, all stored aboard a crashed DH Omni support vessel on the planet Agamar. They were discovered by the rebel crew of the Ghost, and after a mock battle against the still operational droid forces there was interrupted by an Imperial attack, they teamed up with the Separatists to escape in these shuttles. One was shot down by an AT-AT, one was claimed by the super tactical droid General Kalani, and the other was taken by the Ghost crew and modified into their new support craft, the Phantom II. Their VCX series auxiliary shuttle had recently been destroyed, so they were able to alter the Phantom II to fit into the Ghost's docking bay. They also trimmed back its gigantic tail fin and installed 2 forward laser cannons and 2 rear ventral laser turrets, as well as an astromech socket in the middle segment. We sadly do not know the extent of the Sheathipede 3's production run, and likely never will. It could simply have been a one-off prototype, well, 3-off I guess, carried aboard Kalani's DH Omni for all we know. However, I like to think that this version of the ship was primarily meant to be sold on the general civilian market due to its less exaggeratedly bug-like features and more sleek, marketable design. Perhaps the reason we see so few of them is simply that the Separatist Navy didn't order that many, since they already had the convenience of the auto-Sheathipede and the defensive capabilities of the Sheathipede II. The Mark III, therefore, would primarily have ended up in the hands of Neimoidian businessmen and Trade Federation executives just like the original model, which, coincidentally, has about as much screen time as the Sheathipede 3 if you don't count the Phantom. And while it is equally possible that its production run was cut short due to the end of the Clone Wars and the nationalization of the Trade Federation, I doubt that would be the case. Sinar Fleet Systems either acquired or partnered with Heor Chal Engineering to produce the Sinar Chal Utilipede transport sometime after the Clone Wars, so I don't see why they wouldn't have also continued production on the Sheathipede 3. Sheathipede 4. Back when I made the first iteration of this video, I wasn't entirely sure if this was actually a unique variant of the Sheathipede, or just a highly modified Sheathipede 3 like the Phantom. However, upon closer inspection, it would seem that it has to be a new variant, and a very unusual one at that. The Sheathipede 4 was the smallest version of the ship by far, at an estimated 9.5 meters long by 5.1 meters wide and 3.5 tall. Unlike the Sheathipede 3, the on-screen evidence suggests that the Mark IV was indeed downsized that far. Instead of a boarding ramp at the rear, it had a one-seat starfighter-style cockpit, and the side flares that normally tower over characters' heads even on the relatively low-slung Mark III only come up to the shoulders of an average human on the 4. The Mark IV has only ever appeared in one episode, owned by Neimoidian spy Hallian Nark, so the sample size of reference images is very limited, but I am still confident that this is correct. Why it is the case, I have no idea. With only a single-seat cockpit, I'm not sure how you would access the rest of the ship's interior, or what all that space would be used for if you couldn't. Maybe the pilot's seat can turn around, or there is some unnoticeable side hatch like the cargo storage on a coach bus or something. Or both. There's certainly enough room even on this smaller model. The original was the length of a large bus, and this one is still the length of a small bus. But size was not the only alteration to the Sheathipede 4, only the most concrete. The visual changes to the design may merely be the product of Hallian Nark's modifications, but I don't think it would be unreasonable to think that most of them are changes made to the design by the manufacturer. Remember, we know based on its size that it does have to be a new version of the ship. Hallian's shuttle shared many of the same modifications as the Phantom II, and I think it's probably more likely that Sinar Chal would copy Sabine and Hera's work on the Phantom for the Sheathipede 4 than some random pirate spy would have. The vertical fin was much shorter than that of the previous models, with a similar, though not identical, profile to the trimmed fin on the Phantom. It was even shorter yet, with a shallow slope at the front and an even flatter one at the rear. It was also extended out further aft. The whole rear of the ship was angled to give it a sleek, fast look. Its engines were also angled with a slight anhedral and protected in large shrouds. They were also hidden behind a series of vertical fins inside the shroud. Interestingly, as mentioned, the Mark IV had no rear boarding ramp. Instead, there was a section of exposed machinery and an additional central engine consisting of 12 small thruster units hidden behind more vertical fins. Moving forward, the ship had a pair of short wings sticking out of the middle segment of the ship. The function of these is unknown, but this version of the ship lacks the Sheathipede's typical communications antennas, so those could possibly have been housed in the wings. The front segment of the Sheathipede 4 was styled much the same as the Mark III, just smaller. Interestingly though, its cockpit canopy was taller, narrower, and more bulbous, almost like the shape of the original model's canopy. The rear half of it slid backwards to allow access to the cockpit, and at least Hallian's shuttle had red glass instead of the usual black, though that was probably an aftermarket tint to complement his ship's striking paint job. Another element of the Mark IV that was likely one of Nark's modifications were its two forward laser cannons. It's certainly possible that these were original, as two of the versions of the Sheathipede were armed, but it seems odd that they would flip-flop on that by having them on the Mark II, removing them for the Mark III, and then adding new ones in a different location for the Mark IV. Not impossible by any means, but I think it's probably just more likely that Hallian added them himself. Unfortunately, we have absolutely no idea when the Sheathipede 4 entered or left production. Hallian describes his shuttle as a classic that requires highly skilled mechanics to service it, so it can be assumed that it is fairly old as of 34 ABY. It's possible that he was just exaggerating to make sure the crew of the Colossus didn't damage it, but the timeline does line up to make this statement make sense. If the original model was produced around 34 BBY, and the Sheathipede 3 that I suspect was meant to directly replace it entered service around 19 BBY, that would give the Mark I a production run of 15 years. If the Sheathipede 3 ran for 15 years, it would have been replaced by the Mark IV in 4 BBY, and the Mark IV would have been retired around 11 ABY, making Hallian's description of it as a classic 23 to 30 years later in 34 ABY make sense. Of course, this depends on the Sheathipede 1 being almost brand new at the time of the invasion of Naboo, but there's no reason it couldn't be. And, as far as we know, this was the last model of Sheathipede ever produced. Whether it was replaced by an as-yet unseen Sheathipede 5 or simply retired is currently unknown. However, there are still a few more ships in the Sheathipede family to take a look at. Neimoidian Trader. The first, and perhaps least interesting, of our honorable mentions is the Neimoidian Trader, an unnamed and unknown repulsor craft used by the Trade Federation to haul cargo around between cities and ground bases. The vehicle was very similar in appearance to the Sheathipede, but with the front segment sort of compressed, and the middle segment replaced with a longer cargo rack capable of carrying two large cargo containers. You could perhaps consider this to be a predecessor to the Utilipede, though that ship was superior in basically every measurable way. As far as we know, the Neimoidian Trader was only capable of atmospheric flight, though I would bet it could at least reach orbit to allow it to carry cargo to and from Trade Federation Lucrahulks, in addition to ferrying it between ground installations. Assuming its tail fin was the same size as the Sheathipede's, the Neimoidian Trader would be about 18.5 meters long by 9.5 meters wide and 8.5 meters tall. Most of its stats are unknown and impossible to guess just by looking at it, but it required one pilot and could probably carry around 20 to 50 tons of cargo. The Neimoidian Trader was in use around 32 BBY in the invasion of Naboo, but seems to have been retired by the time of the Clone Wars. Maxilipede. Next up is the Maxilipede-class shuttle. This was a slightly larger alternative to the Sheathipede, with two vertical fins instead of one. Its side flares were situated at the bottom of the main hull rather than in the middle, and its landing gear retracted into them rather than just hugging the outside of the hull. Its boarding ramp was on the bottom instead of on the back as well, and it also had a small port for astromech droids to access and make repairs to the ship's exterior in flight. The Maxilipede was actually based on unused concept art for the Sheathipede from the Phantom Menace. Fairly little is known about this ship, other than that it was occasionally used by the Separatists in the Clone Wars. Its official stats seem to have been copied from the Sheathipede 2, which is funny because the Maxilipede is clearly quite a bit larger and lacks the 3 laser cannons. I used to think it was around twice the size of the Sheathipede, but looking at it a little closer, it seems to be more like 1.5 times that size. Somewhere in the ballpark of 22 meters long by 16 meters wide and 18 meters tall. This is supported by both the height of the ship as it passes through the hangar bay door of a Providence-class dreadnought, and a height comparison between its engines and R2-D2 as D-Squad is boarding the ship when escaping. The comparison to the Providence would not be sufficient on its own, as that ship's egregious scaling issues are fairly well known, but with the comparison to R2 yielding about the same height, I think we can safely say that is the right size. Most of the other stats are probably around the same as the Sheathipede, but I would guess it could carry 16 passengers or 100 tons of cargo. It probably cost a bit less than double the price of the Sheathipede, at 200,000 credits as well. Utilipede. The Sinar-Chal Utilipede transport is probably the biggest departure from the normal Sheathipede format of all of the Sheathipede family ships. It retained the same 3-segment layout, but the structure of each segment was radically different. I will save a detailed breakdown of the Utilipede for its own video sometime, but its front section held a rectangular single-seat cockpit, its middle had a large and structurally concerning gap to hold 3 intermodal cargo containers, and its rear section held the customary fin and engines. Its engines were attached partway up the fin, as it didn't have the customary side flares. The ship's landing gear were fully retractable. The rear gear were located on the sides of its rear segment, and its single front gear was on the bottom of the front segment, offset to the right side. The Utilipede was around the same size as the Sheathipede, at about 14 meters long by 5.5 meters wide and 9 meters tall. It likely had a top atmospheric speed of 750 to 850 kilometers per hour and a Class 1 or 2 hyperdrive. It had a crew of 1 and could carry no passengers. What it could carry was around 30 tons of cargo by my estimation, split between 3 large cargo containers in its midsection. I would imagine it could also carry 1 single container the size of 3 of them, or anything else around that size and weight if the pilot preferred. It probably came in at a cost of around 50 to 100,000 credits. We don't know exactly when the Utilipede was put on the market, but it was in service early enough for a partially dismantled one to be available for sale at a used ship lot on Ferrex in 5 BBY, so I would think it probably entered service at least a decade before then, if not during the Clone Wars. It was apparently a joint venture between Heor-Chal and Sinar Fleet Systems, so it would probably have to be built after the Clone Wars, but it's also possible that Heor-Chal started manufacturing them during the Clone Wars, and then Sinar acquired that company afterward and just slapped their name on it, so loyal Imperials wouldn't feel uncomfortable buying from a separatist brand or something. Who knows? The ship saw use with both legitimate shipping companies and all the major crime syndicates throughout the Galactic Civil War, and remained fairly popular for decades afterward. One Utilipede was even owned by a traveling chef named Strano Tuggs around 34 ABY, who used it to restock his restaurant on Batuu with new and interesting ingredients. Utilipede Type B. The final spin-off of the Sheathipede is what I am calling the Utilipede Type B. This was an extended variant of the Utilipede that had room for 6 cargo containers, and had a large divider between groups of 3 of them, housing an additional 2 landing gear. It almost certainly housed a tensor field generator or something similar to increase the structural integrity of the Type B's frighteningly long and thin spine. The normal Utilipede is already fragile enough, but doubling the length of its cargo bay makes it even scarier, at least from a layman's perspective. The stats of the Type B are probably around the same as the first, though it measured 22 meters long instead of 14, its top speed was probably a bit slower, and it likely cost a bit more. When it was manufactured is unknown, but it seems pretty rare and I doubt they sold too many of these things. And that is everything there is to know about the Sheathipede and all its variants. Please let me know which version of the ship is your favorite, or if you think I left anything out. This was the longest and most comprehensive ship breakdown I have ever made, so please like the video and subscribe to the channel as well to show your support. If you made it this far, include like a Beetle emoji or something in your comment to show that you're just as committed to learning about this ship as I am. Or if your keyboard doesn't support emojis, just tell me what your favorite bug is, or make some reference to the soldier beetle that the ship was designed after. Just something to show off that you're a member of the Long Attention Span Club. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week. RFC, out.